Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about theory, question, and method. And what I had said previously is that for me, all three are interconnected. They are not separate entities and they all influence each other. And I think it's a grave and huge oversight if we just look at methods without looking at the theory or the question which is informing the method chosen. So some of the things, and these are more questions as opposed to points, and one of the things that we need to think about, some people call it the research problem, some people call it the research statement, but it's an empirical or it could be a theoretical puzzle that you're attempting to address. Will this be a description of it, or will you be trying to explain it? And basically, I would say, within, every body of knowledge or body of literature, there are certain tensions, there are certain debates. And I suppose what we try to do within our PhD, we try to contribute to that debate, or we try to address or minimize some of the tensions. And the way we do that is through the formulation of a research question and then through data collection. So obviously then, if you have identified your research statement, you've identified these tensions, you've identified this debate, then you will go about formulating your research question or your research questions. Obviously, there will be theoretical assumptions underpinning these research questions and the reason for that is typically our research questions come as a result of gaps in the literature, and they're obviously often formulated as a result or at the end of your review of the literature. So they will have theoretical underpinnings to them. The empirical puzzle that intrigues you. So this is basically, what are you interested in? What do you want to unpack? What do you want to investigate? And I suppose for me, whenever I look at a thesis, obviously chapter 1 is the introduction. Then chapter 2 is your literature review. And at the end of that, that very much identifies the gaps in the literature. That identifies what I would refer to what we don't know. Then you go into your methodology and your methods chapter, and that's your approach in order to actually to investigate what we don't know. And then the empirical evidence is presented in the findings. So it's very much about, the first half of your thesis, setting you up to enter, as we referred to in the last slides, the field in order to collect the empirical data. So look, obviously, what research methods are going to be appropriate, what has been used in the past, what is currently used within your discipline. And also, I think it's very important that we take a critical perspective that the one that you're selecting does have advantages, but it will also have limitations. So it's to be aware of that. Obviously, to state that in your thesis, but also for the Viva situation as well. What theories, and I can, if that's something you want me to look at in more detail, is the role of your theoretical lens. I very much see your theoretical lens as a spotlight. That it goes in and it puts a spotlight on your empirical findings, and then it helps you to make sense, which in other words means it helps you to attach the meaning to what your participants are saying, and then also to make sense of that in order to ultimately to contribute to the body of knowledge in which your thesis is couched. You might look for change, you might look for comparison. So basically change, if you say take a longitudinal perspective, you would look at for developmental change, behavioral change. It might be a comparative approach you're taking. So if you were doing multiple case study, you'd be looking comparisons within cases and between cases. So it could be a comparison. Are you borrowing theory? Or are you looking at a theory that is well used within, say, your discipline? You might be looking at a theory that's not maybe well used in your own discipline, but is used in another discipline. That also sets you up very nicely for making a contribution for a new adaptation of that theory. And, in what ways are you building theory? And that very much infers the inductive approach, which we will look at more as the weeks progress. So your empirical data, where and how this might be obtained. So remember, my analogy that the information is out there. It's waiting for you to go and collect, but you have to think, well, okay, where is it? Who are the participants that have this information? And what are the appropriate tools to actually go and collect it? And in terms of selecting the data, it is very much a theoretical exercise, and we'll unpack that phrase a lot more, because a lot of people would think, oh, selecting data, that's just all empirical, that's you going out into the field. But with your research questions, your literature review, that exercise is very much informed by theory. And then the analysis of that collection of the empirical data is obviously informed by theory, and shaped by it at the same time. So what type of data do you need? We will look at this. This is obviously a nice sort of helicopter view today, and we look at it much more detail in terms of the sampling. The unit of analysis is very important. And I suppose the other thing that I'm quite conscious that I feel that I'm going to prepare you for is also writing publications, either in your PhD, but also after. And this is the sort of thing reviewers would be interested in. What is your unit of analysis? Is it the individual? Is it a team? Is it an organization? Because obviously that influences the sampling, the selection, but also again the analysis as well. Are you interested in the attitudes? Are you interested in the behaviors? And all of this, you need to be very clear on what you're interested in, because if you don't have that clarity, that will be very obvious. It'll be very obvious whenever you go to do your data analysis. It will be very obvious. So having that clarity up front in terms of what you're interested in, your unit of analysis, your sampling technique, will all pay great dividends in terms of transparency, robustness, and also good quality of data at the same time. Language, and I think this is incredibly important. I even think of in my own discipline, in entrepreneurship, that it's very well regarded that the language used for entrepreneurship is of masculine normatives. And so we can look at the language, we can look at metaphors, and I think again that would very much allow sort of discourse analysis. So we'll see if people are interested in that, and we can look at that if that's something people would like me to look at. Social structures, very much about society, behavior, culture, social relations. This is very much relevant for my research, looking at family business, the cultural norms, the values, doing things the way they're supposed to be done, because the family itself and the family structures very much informs the way the business is actually, how business activities are actually operationalized. Social processes, and then how do you actually conceptualize all these? So how do I or can I collect, generate data? That's what we would be looking at. And also, how will these different behaviors, attitudes, how will they manifest? How will we know them? How will we collect them? And more importantly, how do we make sense of them? So these are all the things that we will, be looking at in greater detail, and hopefully providing you a bit of direction on how to make sense of all of this. So your precise empirical question. So your precise empirical question might be different in terms of your broader theoretical question. And I suppose, regardless, the reason why we formulate research questions is basically to help us. You've identified your gaps in the literature. So you think about, okay, how do I formulate questions around that? And then you're going to go into the field, as I call it. And then you're thinking, well, okay, what is the research question that will help me? So all of this is to help us as researchers, because taking on a research project is huge in itself. So we break it down into manageable pieces. And for me, research questions is breaking it down into manageable pieces. Um, as I said before, regardless of what PhD you're doing, the remit of any PhD is to make a contribution to knowledge, and it is your theoretical contributions. And I don't know if you're conscious or aware of this. So what? I'm very conscious of this, and this would be something, whenever whenever you get an article back, or a paper back that you've submitted. Thankfully, not so often now, but the reviewer would say, "So what?" And that's the one thing you do not want anybody to write about your work. And basically, that what they mean when somebody writes "so what" is that they have read your thesis, they have read your paper, and then after reading it, you just go, "So what? I don't see the contribution. I don't see what it adds. I don't see what it contributes." Obviously, that's heartbreaking for us as researchers, and it's something we want to avoid. So it's important then that, we do make a contribution, we do advance understanding. But I think in order to do that, obviously, we have to identify the gaps in knowledge, i.e., literature, we're trying to address and to fill. But we also have to make sure then that the research question we formulate on those gaps allows us to make the contribution. So these are some sort of examples that we have here. How has the content of health, fitness, lifestyle magazines in Ireland changed? What role does advertising play in the uptake of cosmetic surgery in Ireland? What is the role of institutional entrepreneurship in fostering organisational change? Some of them are still quite broad, but and I think it's, formulating your research question, spending some time on that, but also allowing yourself to allow them to change if need be as well, and to give yourself that flexibility is important. So qualitative research as a process, theory, method, analysis, they're all interconnected. They are not separate entities. And I suppose that's the one thing I don't know, those that are further down the line with the thesis, that if you change one part of the thesis, then you have to end up and you're changing other parts of your chapters. And even if you change even a small paragraph, it can have a domino effect on some of the other preceding or subsequent chapters. And that, to me, illustrates that, there are certain chapters in your thesis, but they aren't separate. They are all connected. I really, really love this quote, and it's this idea that, purely empirical investigations, i.e., just going into the field, just going in and doing semi-structured interviews without, looking at the literature, identifying the gaps, formulating your research questions, being aware of what your theoretical framework is, and also of its constructs, is just like going into the sea without a map or a compass. And then sometimes that you might be lucky, but you've just a greater risk of it all just being chaos and just and not being fruitful. And I think that's the other thing, is that, we all get very excited about doing the interviews. We all get very excited about doing the empirical side. And I think for me, the reason that I was excited about that was I wanted to go out and talk to people, but also I was sort of sure of what I was doing, because I thought, well, I know how, at interviews, I know what I'm doing, and I feel that I'm actually achieving something. So when, for example, whenever I would be reading the literature, I kept thinking, am I reading the right literature? Am I doing enough? Should I be reading more? Am I reading it too quickly? Am I reading? So at least then there was all of that, questioning, where at least when I thought, well, I'm doing the interviews, I know what I'm supposed to be doing. But yes, we need to spend the time getting to know the literature, identifying the gaps, formulating your questions, and that will make sure that when you do your empirical investigation, it will yield and generate the information to answer your questions and ultimately make that contribution. That is the remit of your PhD. So designing it, as the data is collected, it will shape the narrative. And again, I love that sort of flexibility, the ongoing, unfolding process. You can talk about your experience in conducting the study and how they shape our interpretations of the results. We'll talk a bit about that then in research reflexivity. This is important because in the last slides, I said that one of the characteristics of qualitative researchers or research was the role of the researcher. So we have to acknowledge that. And I also think then it's quite nice then to be able to say, well, okay, how your own interpretations change, how the actual study evolved, and that acknowledges your role, but also the nature of qualitative research at the same time. We need to be sensitive to ethical considerations, and in this current situation, ethical considerations have taken a different format. They have to be looked at in a different way, and it's something we're all having to deal with at the moment. But we look at, obviously personal information. People can withdraw at any time. Power imbalances, that goes into researcher reflexivity. We can talk about that. Consent, and also confidentiality and anonymity. And one of the things that I tend to do, because whenever we're presenting qualitative data, I think, say you've 12 interviewees, and you have interview 1 and interview 2 and interview 3, and obviously we've promised anonymity, but I like to give them names, or I like to give them like pseudonyms, and I do a lot of research in Saudi Arabia, so I would have a tendency, I would use Saudi names, and that for me helps with the contextualization of the research. The other thing it helps with, as a researcher and as a PhD student, as I said before, whenever somebody's reading your findings, you want them to feel that they've been in the interview with you. So if you can give them pseudonyms, which, maybe reflect the context, that helps with that sense of bringing the data to life. And that's basically is one of your jobs and challenges when you're presenting qualitative research. What makes a good qualitative study? Rigor, robustness, transparency, they are keywords. So the researcher employs rigorous data collection, can collect multiple forms, that helps with triangulation, adequately summarizes the data, and also spends adequate time, and appropriate time for your research question, because your research question will determine how much time is required in the field also. The researcher frames the study within the assumptions and characteristics. And I think, assumptions is a nice way of putting limitations. So you can say, well, this approach is based on the following assumptions. So it means then if there are criticisms raised, you can say, well, okay, if we go back to our assumptions, we are obviously we are conscious of criticisms or limitations. The characteristics of the evolving design, presentation of multiple realities. How do you make sense of that? There may be conflicting realities, and how do you make sense of that and present it in an articulate manner? Research as an instrument of data collection, and also the focus on participants' views and the meanings that they attach to those views at the same time. The process, again, that's what I had mentioned there. The researcher writes persuasively so the reader feels that they are there. And I can give you, as we progress, some tips and hints on how to do that. The writing is clear, engaging, and full of unexpected ideas. And I suppose what I mean by that is that because you'll have your literature review done and you have your literature review chapter, that whenever you go into the findings and the analysis, that you draw on that literature and you don't suddenly present new ideas and new theoretical lenses. So whenever the examiner is reading it, should be no surprises, and that's what I mean about unexpected ideas. It reflects the history, culture, and personal experience of the researcher as well, and also that the research is ethical. But all of these things we will go into much more detail as the week progresses, or the module progresses. So common characteristics of qualitative research. So things that I suppose I've just pulled out here. So it's the social world of participants. We're learning how they make sense of. This is a big issue of how do we make sense of, how do they make sense of? So sense making is an important element of qualitative research. I do like the idea that, there's no doubt that qualitative research is rich, it's complex. That also brings with it certain challenges at the same time. I like openness. That's one word. I think we need to be flexible. We need to be open. There's going to be emergent issues. And also a reflexive approach. And very much that's something that I'm very adamant about. I'm very conscious about. And I suppose one of the reasons I'm very conscious about is that I do conduct gender research. And there's no doubt that the gender of the researcher can actually inform and shape the narrative that is actually co-created between the researcher and the respondent. Okay, let me see.